Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Dr. Fred Hocker. Dr. Hocker serves as the head of research at the Vasa Museum and the Swedish National Maritime and Transport Museums. Located in Stockholm, we'll be learning all about the Vasa Museum, which houses the Vasa, a Swedish warship that sank on its maiden voyage in 1628 and was raised nearly intact from the sea in 1961. We'll go on a behind the scenes tour and in the process come to better understand and appreciate 17th century naval architecture, warfare, and daily life, complete with tools, clothing, food, and even the remains of the crew. Let's start by meeting Dr. Hawker and then learning all about the Vasa Museum. Welcome. So delighted you're able to be here.
Thanks, Jay. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
I have to say, somewhat sheepishly, that it wasn't until a couple of weeks ago that I became aware of the museum, of the Vasa. I have been finding it incredibly fascinating to learn about it, eager to find out more today and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, I think it would be of interest if you'd briefly share a little bit more about your background, perhaps professional interest, academic interest, please.
Sure. I should probably explain my accent. I'm not actually from Sweden. I'm from Virginia. I went to college in New England at Middlebury, and
Wow.
I worked for a while as a shipwright at Mystic Seaport down in Connecticut.
Oh, yeah.
And then I was a professor of maritime archaeology for almost 10 years at Texas A&M University, where I worked mostly in the Mediterranean in Turkey, but
Mm.
in other places. And then about 25 years ago, I was recruited away from Texas to move to Scandinavia, first to the National Museum of Denmark, where I was one of the leaders of their Center for Maritime Archaeology. And then 22 years ago, I moved to Sweden to take up the
Mm.
job I have now as the head of research at the Vasa Museum.
For those watching and others who aren't familiar with the Vasa, could you please share a little bit about the story, why it was built, and what led to its tragic sinking?
Sure. In the 1620s, Sweden had embarked on a program of international expansion. They were in an imperialist phase where they were interested in expanding their borders. And to do that, they had to increase the capability of the navy because almost everywhere that the king, Gustav II Adolf, wanted to take the army, he had to cross water to do it. And so he had embarked on modernizing the Navy he had inherited from his father.
Mhm.
But also, he was interested in a new kind of naval warfare. The Swedish Navy in this period was mostly made of smaller vessels, one deck of guns. And the Navy believed that the primary weapon of a warship was its crew, and that the decisive moment in a naval battle would be a boarding action. But the king, who was a keen artillerist, believed the future of naval warfare would be artillery duels between
Mm.
heavily armed gun platforms. And so in the winter of 1624, 1625, he ordered two new ships of a new type for the Navy. These would have two full gun decks, not one, be much larger vessels, and they would carry much heavier cannon than the traditional Swedish vessel would. They'd have about four times the firepower of a typical Swedish warship. And so the vessel was built in downtown Stockholm between 1626 and 1627. Um, Unfortunately, it took a little bit longer to put together the new armament for the ship, but
Mm.
finally, in the summer of 1628, the ship was ready to deploy to its initial station, which was as the flagship of the reserve squadron in home waters. And so on the 10th of August, 1628, it set sail from the Royal Palace and then managed to make it about 1,300 yards
Wow.
before a gust of wind filled the sails It heeled over so far that the gun ports on the port side were in the water, and the ship filled with water and sank in a matter of a few minutes.
Incredible, incredible. What makes the Vasa ship and fabulous shot here such a significant artifact in maritime and world history?
Well, there are two different parts to that. One is it's a unique source for understanding what the world was like in the first half of the 17th century. This is about the same time that the Pilgrims are establishing
Mm,
Plymouth Plantation. It's about the same time that the Ming Dynasty in China is collapsing to be replaced by the Qing. A lot of things going on. And Vasa encapsulates stuff happening over a very large area because the raw materials and the people that all came together to build it don't just come from Sweden. They come from all over the Baltic and all over Northern Europe. And so in that sense, it's kind of a vehicle for time travel that we can
mm,
use it to investigate everything from the climate in Northern Europe by looking at the tree rings and the timbers. We can look at population movement. We can look at economic forces at play because there's so many foreign commodities and people involved. We can look at immigration because this was part of the Swedish government's attempt to recruit people with expertise in capital to
mm.
Sweden. So that's one thing that makes it very important. The other is that Vasa is one of a number of shipwrecks that were all recovered from the bottom in a very short period, really between 1956 and 1962, in several different places. And that they
Mm.
really created the modern field of maritime archaeology and what the public really understands maritime archaeology is about. Find an important shipwreck, bring it to the surface, conserve it, put it on display for the public. And so at the same time that Vasa was being recovered, five Viking ships in Roskilde Fjord in Denmark were also being
Ah,
excavated.
huh.
Um, George Bass was starting a long series of excavations of ancient merchant ships from the Bronze Age up to the Byzantine period in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in Germany, in 1962, a medieval merchant ship, a cog, largely intact, was recovered from the Weser River near Bremen. And all of
Hmm.
these together created this impression of what maritime archaeology could achieve. But of all of these vessels, Vasa is the most complete. It's about 98% of the original ship that survives. And it was
Incredible,
possible to
incredible.
reassemble it, as you see in this image, so that it still looks like a ship
For
where it's on
sure.
display.
Most definitely. How was it discovered and what was the condition at that time, nearly 300 years?
Well, the important thing to note is it was never lost. That people who worked in Stockholm Harbor, ever since it sank, were aware that there was a big ship
Mhm.
lying at that spot. And a lot of people who understood the Navy's history knew what ship it was. But in the 1950s, uh, one of the civilian engineers who worked for the Navy, a man named Anders Franzén, took an interest in the old ships that had been lost by the Swedish Navy in the 16th and 17th centuries and set himself the task of trying to relocate them. And so one of the ships that he spent 3 years looking for in the 50s was Vasa. It
Ah,
happened to be right next to where he worked, so it was relatively easy for him to go out and search using boats and some equipment provided by the Navy and some equipment that he designed himself.
hmm,
In this picture, he's holding a coring device that he designed. He dragged the bottom of the harbor
hmm.
with a small anchor. And then when it would stick in something, he would drop this device, which would take a sample of it. And what he was looking for is what we call black oak. That is oak that's been underwater for a very long time, and it turns this rich silvery black color. Um, Mostly for the first 2 years, what he said he found was old stolen bicycles and dead cats. Uh, but eventually, in the summer of 1956, he started working with the Navy's chief salvage diver, who knew a lot about the harbor bottom. And they started looking in a place in front of an island called Beckholmen, where they found the vessel,
Mhm.
which is in fact where the historical sources said it had sunk. And then they managed to persuade a number of actors in Sweden, the Navy, the National Heritage Board, the National Maritime Museum, and the biggest private salvage firm in Scandinavia to all combine to create a project to recover the ship to the surface and make it the centerpiece of a new museum that would tell the story of the glorious uh, golden age of Swedish international power, what in Sweden is called the Great Power Period. And so, in a project that lasted 4.5 years, from the fall of 1956 until the spring of 1961, divers dug tunnels under the ship,
Mm,
passed steel cables under the ship, and
wow.
used those to bring the ship to the surface. And then here in this image, you see it just a few days after it had been raised. It's been placed
Incredible.
on a concrete pontoon in a dry dock, and they're starting the process of excavating the interior and the first efforts to stabilize the ship and preserve it.
What are some of the most telling or surprising artifacts that were recovered?
Well, I often answer that question by saying whatever I'm working on right now is the most interesting thing in the world. Uh, Everything that was on board when it sank was, for the most part, still on board when it was found,
Mm,
with the exception of most of the cannon had been salvaged in the 17th century, about 35 years after the ship sank, and then some really delicate organic material. But some other very fragile materials surprisingly survived. And for me, these are the most remarkable objects, and that's the ship's sails.
mm,
The ship was rigged with 10 sails, but only four of them were mounted on the yards when it sank. The other four were still folded up and packaged just as they come from the sailmaker and were stored in a compartment, closed compartment, far down in the ship. And it was possible to recover them and in a 10-year conservation process, very carefully unfold them and put them back together to
mm.
understand how
Wow.
these sails were made and what the rigging looked like. This picture shows the smallest of the ship's sails, which is also the best preserved, the fore topgallantsail. Um, but we have fragments of five other whole sails, plus a piece that you attached to the bottom of a sail to make it bigger, and even the two sails for the ship's longboat.
Mm.
And they
What are
are a more or less unique survival.
what are some of the biggest challenges in preserving a ship like the Vasa?
Well, initially, the biggest challenge had to do with its waterlogged condition. The ship looked like it was in astonishing shape. The timbers were still
Mm,
in very many cases, hard, very strong. But in fact, waterlogging dissolves the insides of the cells. And if you simply dry the wood, the cells will collapse due to atmospheric pressure, and then the wood will crack and distort. And so you have to replace the water with something else that can dry and harden. And so Vasa pioneered a technique of replacing the water with another chemical called polyethylene glycol, which
mm,
is a water-soluble synthetic wax that became effectively the standard treatment for big waterlogged objects and has been used ever since in various variations on that first treatment. This image shows the ship being sprayed. It was sprayed with the chemical uh, all day long for 17 years to saturate the timbers fully with the polyethylene glycol, or PEG as we call it. And then it was allowed to dry slowly. And after that, it could be moved into the current museum and then re-rigged with its lower masts, because even the lower masts survived. And
mm,
the round platforms at the tops of the masts, called tops, you can see one in the foreground of this image, they're mostly
mhm,
original. And we even have most of the rigging components from the lower rig. So blocks and deadeyes and UFROs and parrels, although not very much rope. The rope you see here is new.
mm. Incredible, incredible. Can you
Now,
brief?
however, the main challenge is structural. No, the next picture is good, actually. The the timber actually only has about half of its original strength, and the use of the polyethylene glycol, while it stabilizes the wood, also acts like an internal lubricant, and so
Mm,
it makes the wood less stiff. And so the ship can't support its own weight as a wooden structure, and so it needs reinforcement. And it also needs replacement of all the fastenings that originally held it together. Here are two of my colleagues, Uwe and
Hmm.
Monica, who
Huh.
are in the process of replacing the iron bolts that originally held the deck structure to the sides. And these have been replaced with stainless steel bolts. The originals corroded away long ago. They were replaced in the 1960s with mild steel. Those are starting to rust now. So we've replaced almost 5,000 bolts. And then the second challenge is that the support structure under the ship, what you see here,
Hmm.
that was built in the 1960s and improved in the 1990s, really was not designed with any regard to how the ship distributes its own weight, how the ship functions as a structure. And so the easiest way to think of that is the supports aren't under the heavy places in the ship. And so the ship was bulging in between
Hmm.
those supports. And so we've started just in the past year, after a very long design process, installing an entirely new support structure for the ship.
Wow.
You can see the original support structure are the heavy brown, really blocky, clunky looking steel
Yeah.
structures. And workmen are here installing the first of a series of 26 new cradle elements that are actually much lighter because they don't need to be as heavy as the others because there are more of them. And that will be combined with an internal structure that will carry the deck weight separately. One of the reasons the ship sank is that the deck structure is too heavy. One of the
Hmm.
reasons the ship is in danger now is because the deck structure is too heavy. And we have to
Hmm.
support that deck structure separately than we support the rest of the ship because the decks are trying to crush the sides.
Are there any recent or current discoveries that have provided even additional insight to the ship and its construction?
There are. We had a project that ran for about 3 years recently where we were trying to determine what had happened to all the cannon that were salvaged from Vasa in the 1660s. And were there any cannons still on the bottom?
Hmm.
The historical sources suggest that they had dropped one cannon that they weren't able to find again. And so we carried out a survey at the place where the ship sank, which had been very thoroughly excavated in the 1960s, just to check if that cannon wasn't there. We didn't find any cannon, but what we did find is that there are still a bunch of timbers up where the bow of the ship was, that might include missing bits of the ship.
Hmm.
And one of the things we found was this plank that you can see in this image. And this has one straight edge near the camera, and the farther edge is actually the arc of a circle.
Hmm.
And you can see there are holes in it. Fortunately, we have other planks like this one, so we were able to see exactly what this is. This is part of the round platform at the top of a mast,
Hmm.
called a top,
Uh-huh.
sometimes called a fighting top. And because we know exactly which part this is, and we can measure it, and we can see it's not a missing piece of any of the other tops, but it is the only surviving piece of the very small top that was at the outer end of the bowsprit. And in fact, the spot where this was found is directly under where that would have been. And so this one piece, because we have comparative material, gives us enough information that we can reconstruct exactly how that entire top looked, which will help us reconstruct the entire forward end of the rig of the ship, which to me is a really fascinating and exciting discovery because
Yeah,
it'll
for
it'll
sure.
let us complete our understanding of the rig. We understood how the main masts that are mounted in the hull worked, but not so much the one that was on the end of the bowsprit. But thanks to this one piece of wood, which is only about 4 feet long,
Wow.
that there's an enormous amount of information in all of the edges and holes in it.
That's incredible. That's incredible. How does the museum balance the need to keep preserving the Vasa with making it open and available for the public to tour and enjoy the numerous artifacts and exhibits?
Well, we start by being open 361 days a year.
Okay.
As most tourists who go to Europe will tell you, everything's closed on Monday,
Okay.
except the Vasa Museum. We're open every day except Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, New Year's Eve, and New Year's Day. Although some years we're open on New Year's Eve, that varies. And we have relatively long hours in the summer, 8:30 to 6 p.m., 8:30 in the
Mm,
morning to 6 p.m.
mm,
And we're open late on Wednesdays. So we try to accommodate as many people as we can. However, we try to keep the conditions inside the museum comfortable for the ship, not the visitors.
mm.
So, and what we need to do is we need to maintain a very stable climate. And that stability is actually slightly more important than the actual values we choose for temperature and humidity. But we maintain the ship at about 17 degrees Celsius. That's 65 degrees Fahrenheit, I guess,
Mhm.
and 53% humidity. And so we always recommend to people, if you're coming to the Vasa Museum, wear a sweater
Okay.
because it is a little cool and clammy inside. But that's an optimum climate for the stable preservation of the timber in the ship.
What are some of the things that's been learned about the people who are aboard the ship?
Well, that's been the focus, a very tight focus of our research here in the most recent years. And in fact, we've just published about 2 months ago this book,
Mm,
In Life and Death, that accompanies a new exhibition of the same title. This looks at the remains of 15 people who died when the ship sank. About 30 people died altogether, and historical sources indicate that those 30 people included women and children, because the Swedish Navy allowed sailors to have their families living on
ah,
board
mm,
as long as the ship was in home waters and not expected to meet the enemy. And so those 15 people are 13 men and 2 women, ranging in age from mid-teens, say 14 to 16 years old, up to 50, maybe a little older. Although most of them are men who cluster in their 20s and 30s, which is what you'd expect in a military group of people. But
terrific.
those people were relatively well preserved. In one case, we don't just have bones; we also have a brain, fingernails, and hair.
Mm,
Um, and a lot of them were still wearing fragments of their clothing and had things in their pockets. Preservation for organic material is extraordinarily good on the bottom of Stockholm Harbor. And so in this project, Life and Death, we examined all of those people individually and tried to find out as much as we could about each one to create a biography of that person.
wow.
And
Mm,
so things we were able to do is we were able to extract DNA from all of them. And we could learn a lot about people from that. We can tell, for example, it confirmed sex for all 15 people, which was a bit of a surprise. It did reveal that one of the people we had been exhibiting for 20 years as a man is actually a woman.
mm,
And that's the person who's illustrated on the cover of the book here. That's the skull of that person, Skeleton
aha.
G, who we had for the exhibit called Gustav, but in the new exhibit, that person is called Gertrude.
Mm,
And that's a reconstruction of her face on the left, based on the shape of her skull by a forensic artist.
nice.
The that DNA also gives us a sense of where their families come from. We can
Mm,
see that all the people are from Scandinavia, most likely, or from families that had been in Scandinavia a long time. We can look at they can tell we also can tell you for most of them what color eyes and hair they had and what sort of skin tone they had. Uh, not a big shocker here. They're mostly blonde and blue-eyed. Um, but we do have one redhead, the skeleton D, we call David, was a redhead. We can get some sense of their physical build, both from their bones, but also from their DNA, whether what the balance is between fast twitch and slow twitch muscle is
mm,
genetic. And that tells us whether you're a natural sprinter or a marathoner, whether you can lift heavy weights or whether you can lift light weights for a long time. And we can see that variation. We can also learn some things that are really intriguing but not historically important. We can tell which ones had wet earwax and which ones had dry earwax, which ones would have thought cilantro tasted bad,
mm,
because that's genetic. We
mm.
could tell you which ones can roll their tongues and which ones can't, because that's a genetic trait.
Wow. Oh,
Um, we can also look at isotopes in their bones. The phrase "you are what you eat" is literally true,
mm,
that the chemistry of the dirt in which the crops grow is transferred into your bones. And so if we look at the distribution of carbon and sulfur and strontium and uh, nitrogen isotopes in your bones and teeth, we can tell you where you grew up and where you've lived in the last 5 to 10 years. We can tell what you've been eating, whether you're a vegetarian, whether you
Wow.
mostly eat herbivores like beef, or whether
Mm,
you eat pork, because pork, pigs don't just eat plants, they also eat meat, or whether you eat game, that sort of thing. We can tell whether you eat a lot of fish and whether that fish was freshwater fish or saltwater fish. And so we can develop a great deal of detail about these people. We can look at their bones and see how tall they were, what kind of build they had. We can look at injuries they had.
mm,
Um, and we can see
wow.
that more than half of these people had healed broken bones. That's about twice the rate as in the modern population.
Mm,
They
mm,
lived in a rough time, in a violent time,
mm.
a lot more traumatic, injuries.
That's fascinating research, and I know it's just ongoing. What an incredible read that book is. Definitely on a look for it for sure. What's been some of the reaction that you typically see or hear of visitors to the museum, especially for the first time?
Well, the design of the museum was created by a pair of Swedish architects around something we call the oh wow moment. And that is there's a large open space when you come in the door that gives you the optimum view of the ship.
Ah,
And it is one of the largest mobile man-made objects exhibited indoors, which makes it look even bigger than it really is. If you saw it outside tied up to the quay, it wouldn't look nearly as big as it is when
mm.
you come in the door. You're standing at what is the water line of the ship, so it's the same view you would have standing on the pier, looking up at this towering hull. And because it is so complete, it surprises people. One of the reactions we get that we find entertaining is a lot of people come to our museum because they've been told by their friends, you have to go see the Vasa Museum. But their friends didn't tell them why or what you're going to see there. You just have to go to the Vasa Museum.
Yeah.
And people come in the door and go, oh my God, it's a ship. They had no idea what it was. And a lot of people don't believe that it's real. They're convinced that it's a
Mm.
plastic replica or something like that.
Wow.
And so one of the things that our guides are required to say in their guided tours is they have to note that what you're looking at is 98% original timber from almost 400 years ago.
Just incredible. I mean, hearing you share some of the background, the current research, it's no surprise that the Vasa Museum is the most visited museum in Sweden.
In Scandinavia.
Wow, fabulous,
And
fabulous.
we're usually the most visited maritime museum in the world.
Wow, wow. Well, again, as I started, I hope I have the opportunity to visit someday myself. But Dr. Hocker, unfortunately, we've ended the time for the program. I want to thank you so much for being here and providing the wonderful overview for the Vasa Museum, the ship itself, and all that we've been learning and continue to learn from both of them. Thanks again. Continued success with future endeavors.
Thanks, Jay. It's been a pleasure. And if you do get to Stockholm, give me a call. I'd love to show you around the museum.
Wonderful. Thank you. Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.